what caused your concern about this? Tell us how long you've been working on this and why.
Well, in 1974, India exploded its first atomic bomb using plutonium produced from a nuclear reactor given by Canada as a gift. And I learned at that point that every nuclear reactor produces plutonium. It's a man-made element. It doesn't exist in nature. If you went over the world searching for plutonium, the only place you will find it is where mankind has made it. And they make it in a nuclear reactor. As a matter of fact, the first reactors ever built were precisely to produce plutonium for bombs. And even in Canada, they have a plaque, a bronze plaque at Chalk River, Ontario, saying that this is the site where the first nuclear chain reaction occurred in Canada in 1945, originally a part of a program to produce plutonium for atomic bombs. In fact, Canada, which prides itself on being a peaceful country, actually financed all the development of our nuclear reactor program by selling plutonium to the American military, and that plutonium went right into the bomb program. We also sold uranium. We supplied uranium for the Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombs, for the World War II atomic bomb project, and we sold uranium, which were into the nuclear weapons buildup after the war, right up until 1965, when we changed our policy and said we'll no longer sell uranium for weapons purposes. But the problem is that every reactor in the world produces plutonium. The first reactors were built to produce plutonium. And the idea of generating electricity came about by basically saying, well, look, we're producing plutonium anyway, so why don't we generate electricity with the waste heat? Because there's an awful lot of heat produced. But in fact, plutonium has a 24,000-year half-life, which means it's going to be around for hundreds of thousands of years. So when you look at a nuclear reactor, the main product of that nuclear reactor is plutonium. There's only a temporary flash in the pan that gives you electricity. And that's only for a few decades. You could have maybe 30 or 40 years worth of electricity, and then you've got 1,000,000 years worth of plutonium. So we as a human, as a race on this planet, we are sowing the seeds of not only our own destruction, but the possible destruction of all life on Earth. Because anybody who has really looked at the question realizes that an all-out nuclear war would in fact destroy most higher forms of life on Earth, besides destroying human civilization. So we're the only species on the planet who has developed the ability to undo 4 billion years of evolution through our own technology. And if we don't, this means that nuclear power actually represents an evolutionary crisis, a crisis in the evolution of life on Earth. If we don't pull ourselves together and eliminate these dangers, then we are going to undo evolution. So I think it's a very, very serious problem that requires the human race to grow up. We are acting like adolescents who have no responsibility, trashing our planet. And if we continue to do so, we're going to be successful in destroying it. So this is really the problem. You can't destroy plutonium once it's created, and it's going to be around for a very long time. We've got to stop spreading it around.
You really have presented us with a lot of information over your times here in 3 different presentations. And sometimes the more I hear and the more I know, the more discouraged I get. How do you feel about all this? You've been working with it for a while. Do you feel that we will be able to go ahead and make progress in what you've laid out?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I think the human spirit is very adaptable. And I mean, if humans can do away with apartheid, if humans can bring about the collapse of the Soviet Empire without even violence, then I think that we can certainly accomplish tasks. The main thing is that we have to not allow ourselves to be shunted aside. And the difficulty is that people are mystified. They don't really understand what they're facing. And so I feel that demystification is empowerment. And that by my role, which I seem to be good at, is demystifying the technology so that people can understand what the challenge is. Once that challenge is clear, then I think people have it within their power to take control of it and to protect their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and their grandchildren's grandchildren. And that's really what it's all about. So the important thing here is to realize that if you leave it in the hands of people who have other interests other than protection, then you're not going to get protection. You need to take it out of the hands of the nuclear industry, which really wants to foster the industry and wants to perpetuate the industry, which means perpetuating the production of nuclear waste. What we need to do is get the communities and the local governments to be in charge of what's being done. And the industry should be there to perform the functions that need to be done as contractors, but not as the people who are calling the shots. And I think once people take charge of their own futures, then they can, in fact, provide. It's important to realize that, that we do know how to package this nuclear waste so that it will stay out of the environment. We do know how to build those packages strong enough that they can resist natural forces and even man-made malicious forces. And but we need to have constant monitoring and constant retrievability so that when things start going wrong, they are immediately detected and the alarm goes out, hey, something is leaking, we got to do something about it right away. And that's the time you have to repackage the waste and collect together the contaminated soil that might have been, or the contaminated material that might have leaked out, and put it back into an even better container that it was in before. And each generation really has to be an ongoing intergenerational effort. So I think it's certainly doable. It's just a question of understanding that that is what we have to do.
Could you offer us a few comments on activation?
Yeah, and activation is, in order to get a nuclear reaction going, you need to have particles called neutrons, which are projectiles, subatomic projectiles, that strike an atom, and in the case of uranium, a certain type of uranium atom, it can create fission, which means you get a lot of energy released, and you get broken pieces of the uranium atom. And the important thing there is that you get more neutrons given off. So one neutron splits the atom and releases 2 or 3 more neutrons. So if you have a lot of this uranium together at one spot, then you can get a multiplication, very rapid multiplication of the energy being released and the splitting of the atoms. And that's really what an atomic bomb is. An atomic bomb is when you see the destruction at Hiroshima as a result of the first atomic bomb that was dropped on a city of innocent women, men, and children. Really, you know, you talk about a terrorist attack. If what could be more terrorist than incinerating a city full of men, women, and children? At any rate, it was during wartime, etc. But at the same time, it's a terrible prospect. And those neutrons that cause the splitting of the atoms, they are effective in making non-radioactive atoms radioactive. It turns out that they destabilize normal atoms.
Just by being in contact with them.
Just by being bombarded with them and absorbing them. If you took, for example, people have heard the word tritium. Tritium is radioactive hydrogen. Now, what is radioactive hydrogen? Does it exist in nature? Well, yes, there is a small amount of tritium existing in nature. Not very large quantity, but a small amount. But if you just put ordinary water inside a nuclear reactor where all the neutrons are flying around, some of those water molecules, which have hydrogen in them, are going to absorb neutrons, and the hydrogen will become radioactive. And so when you take that water out of the reactor, it's now radioactive water. And the radioactive hydrogen is called tritium. It's 3 times heavier than normal hydrogen. Why? Because it's absorbed 2 neutrons, and 2 neutrons added to the nucleus that was already there makes it 3 times heavier. But it's radioactive, and what does that mean? It means that this nucleus, this substance, this atom, is unstable, and in order to release the internal unstable energy it has, it flies out and throws out an ionizing particle, an alpha particle, a beta particle, or a gamma ray. In this case, it's a beta particle for tritium. And these ionizing particles that are given off, it's like a tiny miniature explosion that throws off shrapnel, and the shrapnel breaks the bonds of the chemical elements around, which in case of your body happen to be you, and that's what does the damage. So it turns out that there are virtually any non-radioactive material, if put into an environment where there's neutrons, will be activated. In fact, when they explode an atomic bomb, there's so many neutrons coming off the bomb that the soil, even the soil that's scooped up into the fireball, that's really just ordinary soil, but a lot of it has become radioactive by activation, which means the neutrons have activated. In the core of a nuclear reactor, activation is going on all the time. Water is being activated to produce tritium. Air is being activated to produce carbon-14, which is radioactive carbon. The steel is being activated to produce a very strong gamma-emitting substance called cobalt-60. Cobalt-60 does not exist in nature, but steel has a non-radioactive version of cobalt called cobalt-59, and when it absorbs a neutron, it becomes cobalt-60 and becomes like a miniature X-ray machine that cannot be turned off. It's giving off powerful gamma rays, and it will do that for many, many years to come. So that's the problem. The problem is activation. This is why, even after they remove the radioactive waste from the core of a nuclear reactor, you'd think that everything should be okay. But the actual structural materials in the core of the reactor, the steel and the concrete and the pipes and the valves, they have become radioactive by activation. That's why decommissioning is a difficult job. From taking apart a nuclear reactor, you would have thousands of truckloads of radioactive rubble just from the structural materials alone. And that's
not including the highly radioactive parts in the reactor.
The highly radioactive spent fuel. Now, in addition to the core of the reactor being activated, you also have water going through in a loop called the primary cooling system, and that water picks up activation products, which are the things that have been activated, as well as leaking bits of the fuel bundles themselves, and carries it through the whole water system. So all that water system, that whole piping system, becomes radioactive through contamination of activation products and fission products. So this is why nuclear power is the ultimate of the throwaway society. Because these materials, which are among the most beautiful materials, the most beautiful stainless steel that has ever been made, you can find in a nuclear power plant. That stuff can never be reused. It can never be recycled. Recycling is out of the question. It has to be buried as radioactive waste or stored as radioactive waste. So they often say that if solar energy is the ultimate in renewable and sustainable energy, nuclear power is the ultimate in throwaway energy.
Well, that's not what we need these days. What we need is renewable energy that can be clean and safe. Could you talk, please, a little bit about ionizing radiation?
Okay, ionizing radiation is actually there's atomic radiation, which comes from radioactive materials. And there's another form of ionizing radiation which comes from X-ray machines. There's a difference, though. Okay. With X-ray machines, you can turn them off. And with X-ray, if you turn off an X-ray machine, it's harmless. It's not radioactive. It's no longer a danger. However, when it's turned on, the X-rays are so energetic that they break chemical bonds randomly. And that's why they're very careful about use of X-rays. You know, the technician steps out of the room before turning the switch because that technician doesn't want to get repeated exposures to X-rays. The damage builds up, and that damage can be magnified by biological reproduction so that one damaged cell, if it's damaged and able to reproduce, then it can reproduce and reproduce and reproduce and become a cancer. And that happens with X-rays too. So we have to be careful to keep the X-rays in check. It shouldn't be used carelessly. It's not just a convenience for the doctors to get nice pictures. It should be used, sparingly. And sometimes the medical profession is at fault by overusing the X-rays. Well, but when it comes to radioactivity, you can't shut it off. These are radioactive materials, and they are constantly giving off bursts of radiation which ionize. And what ionizing means is that it breaks the molecules apart randomly, and these broken pieces of molecules are called ions. They're electrically charged, and because they're electrically charged, they are immediately attracted to combine with other. It doesn't matter if your body is getting a large dose or a small dose. If one of your cells encounters one of these ionizing rays in such a way that it turns into a cancer cell, it doesn't matter what the size of the dose was that got the ball rolling, as it were.
Oh my.
So what they have found is that if you double the dose of a large population, you will see twice as many cancers. If you triple the dose, you'll see 3 times as many cancers. But there is no safe level where you will have no risk of cancer. And that's so that if you take an accident like the Japanese Fukushima triple meltdown, there you could say that the doses that people receive are very small, which happens to be pretty well true, but there are tens of millions of people who are being exposed to that. So when you take a small dose and expose tens of millions of people to it, you get a lot of cancers that simply because of the size of the population that's being exposed. And that's, again, where people are oftentimes misled. Once people understand the nature of the risk, then they realize that what has to be done about it. When I was a boy, they used to do some very ridiculous things. They used to have X-ray machines in shoe stores. You could watch your toes wriggle in your shoes. Well, that's very dangerous, and it's irresponsible, and they have stopped doing it. When I was a boy, they used to have buses with X-ray facilities that would pull into schoolyards, and it would take everybody out of the school and march them through the bus to get chest X-rays. They figured that you should have a chest X-ray every year. Well, this is foolish, and it causes lung cancer. So you're trying to protect people, and you're actually causing damage, harmfulness, far in excess of any benefit that you could achieve from this. They used to have, in heart patients, they used to have plutonium pacemakers that had plutonium in it to make the pacemaker work properly. They don't do that anymore. So I think that as a society, we need to realize that it's necessary to understand the nature of these risks, understand that these risks are unnecessary and very harmful, and take steps to prevent it. When the nuclear industry began, they didn't tell people that there was a problem with waste. They said it was clean energy. And for the first 30 years of the nuclear industry, 40s, 50s, 60s, right up into the 70s, there was really no acknowledgement that this was a major problem. It was only around the middle of the 1970s that reports began to come out in the United States, in Britain, in Canada, about this terrific problem, because the nuclear waste is going to remain dangerous for literally millions of years, and it is so toxic that it surpasses all other toxic waste that we've ever known. For example, in Canada, there was a report from a Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning which made a calculation that just the waste from one nuclear reactor in Canada, just 1 year's waste, would be enough if you wanted to dissolve this to the maximum permissible concentration of radioactivity. You would require a quantity of water approximately equal to Lake Superior. And now you think about 20 reactors in Canada operating for 30 years each, that would require 600 Lake Superiors. We don't have 600 Lake Superiors. And that means that to store this waste, it has to be not just 90% perfect or 99.99% perfect. It has to be far more perfect than that, because if only 1/1000th of 1% of this material leaks into the environment, it's a disaster. So this is why it is really an unsolved problem of the human race, because we have not successfully disposed of anything in our entire history. So why should we begin with the most toxic material that we've ever known and say, oh, we know how to dispose of this, even though we've never disposed of anything else? And so what we have here is a scientific lie. It's really using the scientific priesthood, or putting on the robes of the scientific priesthood, to tell people, rest assured, science will solve this problem. The fact is, we don't even have principles of science that can predict what's going to happen in such an enormously long period of time. We have no method of science that will tell us that when we put something in one place, it will stay there for the next million years. In fact, nature has proven us wrong time and time again, because nature is the great recycler. It has ways of recycling things that you wouldn't believe would be able to be recycled. We found DDT in the middle of the Sahara Desert. We found DDT in the Greenland ice sheet, even though DDT was never used in those places. So it just shows that this material, nature has ways of circulating it around the globe. So this is the bottom line, is that if we do not have a solution to a problem, we have to begin honestly by admitting that. And that means that having no solution, we have to figure out what is the best way to keep it out of the environment. And the best way to do that is by having constant monitoring and surveillance and making sure that that waste is accessible and retrievable for safety purposes. Now, granted, people don't want to have this waste in their communities, but there it is. We have produced this waste through nuclear power. And the first thing to do is to stop making more of it, because this just makes the problem worse and worse and worse. So we should stop making it, and we should make sure that it is packaged in the best possible way, and that there are people in charge who are available to monitor it for the long term in the future, and able to repackage it and retrieve it whenever necessary to make sure that people are protected and the environment is protected. If and when this stuff starts to leak, that somebody should be able to blow the whistle, ring the alarm bell, and say, hey, we've got a problem, let's get to work right away. We've got to stop this from getting worse. And in fact, we have to go back to a more stable configuration, that is, repackage the waste and make it safer. So this is what we should be concentrating on here. We call it rolling stewardship. This is a concept that was actually developed by the National Academy of Sciences in 1985 in connection with other types of toxic materials, not radioactive materials, but things like heavy metals like arsenic and mercury and lead and so on. They said that you really have to have an institutional commitment to having an organization that will monitor this waste and that will be ready to take action whenever anything starts to go wrong. And they must have the resources and the knowledge and the expertise to be able to deal with that problem. Now we're suggesting something like a 20-year turnover, so that every 20 years or so you could have a kind of a changing of the guard. And this could be done with a lot of fanfare and publicity, because it's important that the community know about these problems and how well or not well they're being looked after. The reason for community awareness, and this is long-term going into the future, the reason for community awareness is so that the resources will be made available, because people will realize it's in their own best interest to make sure that sufficient resources are available to do the corrective action, to take the corrective measures. And so the idea of a changing of the guard every 20 years would give a chance to have this broadcast on television, and to have the new people who are taking over the responsibility of monitoring this waste to be fully informed. They will be told, okay, this is what we know about this waste, this is why it is so dangerous, this is why you must take every precaution in order to maintain it in the best possible state. And we expect you, as the next incoming guardians, to improve what we have done, because knowledge advances, abilities advance, and gradually we can get better and better at managing this waste in the best way possible, and eventually never give up the search for a real solution. We may be able one day to find a solution. Perhaps science will develop a way that will allow us to neutralize this waste. Perhaps we will develop a way that we can safely put it into a place where it will be destroyed, like the center of the sun, for example. But until that day, it is our responsibility to the planet as well as to ourselves to guard it and to monitor it and to make it retrievable. This is called rolling stewardship. In the meantime, we just have to admit that it was a big mistake embarking upon this exercise without having a solution. And therefore, we should stop producing it. We should stop producing more of it. Okay. The first problem is that the industry does not really want to solve the problem in the sense of getting rid of the waste. They simply want to clear the deck so they can make more. Now, if they make more, if the reactors continue to operate, even if they had a perfect geological repository, which probably doesn't exist, But even if they had one, if they put that waste as rapidly as possible into the underground repository, rapidly as possible is not very fast, because the reactor waste that comes out is so hot and so radioactive that it has to be cooled in a wet storage bin, called a pool, a spent fuel pool, for at least 5 to 10 years. And then, even in dry storage, when it's taken out of the pool, it generates so much heat that you can't put it underground for a simple reason. When you put it underground, there's nowhere for the heat to go. And so the heat builds up, and you get a build-up of heat, which actually, we've done calculations in Canada. The Atomic Energy of Canada Limited has done calculations showing that the heat build-up, heating up the rock structures and cooling down again, takes about 50,000 years. And in the course of that time, it creates pressures, underground pressures, which can lead to pushing liquid water, which is going to fill the cavity once it's opened up. It's going to flood for sure. There's no question about that. You look at any abandoned mine, it's always flooded. And so that water is going to then have pressure to move outwards away from the waste because of the heat. That heat becomes a driving pressure. And that compromises the integrity of the repository itself. They can't put it down there too early. They have to wait. If we do that and we keep producing waste, then we have about 20 years worth of very hot, very radioactive waste sitting beside every nuclear reactor that's operating. Even if you put the older stuff underground as rapidly as possible, you still have disaster at the surface waiting to happen. Now, the hottest waste is the worst waste. The more recently it's out of the reactor, the more likely it is to disperse. The radioactivity falls off with time. So the worst is the freshest. And in fact, the stuff that's in the core of the reactor is the worst of all, because that stuff is so hot that just by shutting off the electricity, like as happened at Fukushima, the reactor will simply melt down under its own radioactivity. That's caused only by the radioactivity. Many people don't realize that all the destruction at Fukushima and at Chernobyl was caused not by the nuclear reaction, which was shut off, but by the radioactivity of the core. In other words, the radioactive waste is what did that damage. It just shows you how powerful this waste is. It's not inert like a rock. It's active. It produces heat. That's active. It produces chemical changes. That's active. It produces radioactivity, which gives off rays. That's active. And we've had one experience in Carlsbad, New Mexico, just a couple of years ago, where they had drums of low-level waste, not even as hot as this stuff, stored in barrels underground 750 meters down deep. And one of those barrels exploded and turned into a flamethrower, and plutonium went up 750 meters to the surface, contaminated 22 workers, and then drifted downwind to Carlsbad, New Mexico. And what caused this? It was the fact that they used kitty litter as packing material, and the radioactivity causes chemical reactions to occur. Every scientist knows this. And the chemical reactions build up gas, and that gas is what exploded and burst the barrel and also ignited and turned it into a flamethrower. So you have to realize, people have to realize that this waste is active. It's not inactive. That's why we use the word radioactive. In fact, when we measure the radioactivity, we call it activity, because that's what it is. So this is why putting it underground is not a solution. It's really just a solution to the industry's public relations problem. They want to be able to point to something and say, look, we have a solution, ha ha ha, and therefore we can keep on producing it, making sure that it is not a solution. So people cannot be fooled by this. They also have to realize that the industry has a conflict of interest. They have a built-in conflict of interest. In Germany, they had a deep underground repository for low-level waste called the Asse 2 salt mine, and they put waste down there for many, many years. Turned out that that salt mine was leaking radioactivity for 10 years before the nuclear people in charge told the authorities that it was a problem. Why did they not tell the authorities right away? The reason is it would be bad public relations for the industry. So they have a conflict of interest. If things start going wrong, they don't want to tell people. In fact, we've seen this time and time again at 3 Mile Island,
with the Chernobyl accident. Don't tell people. Even at Fukushima, the TEPCO company, they lied about what was going on. They knew what was happening and they lied about it. Why? Because the industry has a huge public relations problem, and consequently they are conflicted when it comes to dealing with problems. They do want to deal with the problems, but even if the problem is beyond their ability to deal with, they don't want to confess to people or to the public that, in fact, things are going to hell in a handcart. So this is the reason why the industry itself cannot be in charge of this. You have to have an agency which is independent of the nuclear industry, which has no conflict of interest, an agency which is dedicated solely to protecting human health and the environment, to look after the long-term storage of this waste. At any rate, it's premature to even think about doing that over the long term until all the reactors are shut down. Then you have a manageable problem in the sense that you have a finite amount. Also, the hottest stuff, the stuff that was just produced this year, has a chance to cool off. And after 20 years or so, it is a lot less volatile. It's not any more likely to melt itself, for example, into the ground, suffer a meltdown. You begin to have a greater comprehension of the scope of the problem and the dimensions of the problem, and then you can sort of calmly go about figuring out what is really and truly the best way of making sure that this material stays out of the environment. And if at some future time we are able to solve the problems connected with a longer-term solution, that can be implemented only when we really have the science. At the present time, we do not. Anybody, and I have been on panels confronting the people who are actually looking after the storage, geological storage of waste. We, in fact, had a 10-year environmental assessment with panels being held, public meetings being held by the government in 5 different provinces of Canada about the proposal for geological storage of nuclear waste. And the panel concluded that although by normal engineering standards it would be judged to be reasonably acceptable in terms of safety, because of the long term involved, because of the fact that there would be nobody on site to see what's happening underground, that changes the picture altogether, and in fact it's not acceptably safe under those circumstances. It's as if you built a huge machine like a nuclear reactor that was very dangerous, containing very dangerous materials, and you turned the button and then you just decided that nobody was ever going to look at it again. You were just going to walk away and let the machine look after itself. Now, that's what an underground dump is. When you put the waste underground, they call it a repository. It's really a dump. Because a repository is when you look after things. When you have a book repository at the Library of Congress, you have people there who are dedicated to keep those books in really good shape. They don't abandon them. So when we talk about disposal of nuclear waste, cross out the word disposal and put the word abandonment, because that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about taking the most dangerous material ever produced by any civilization, and material which is indestructible and will remain highly toxic for millions of years, and we are just simply going to abandon it. That is not an ethical position. We can't abandon it. We have to look after it. Rolling stewardship is an alternative plan, not a solution, but a plan for managing this waste. We do know how to package it. We do know how to take measures to stop it from contaminating the environment. That's what we have to do. The waste is active. We have to be active also.